The revelations emerging from the young and the restless paint a vivid picture of a town reeling from shock, fear, and long-buried ghosts resurfacing at the worst possible moment. Sharon Newman, never one to abandon those she loves, found herself unexpectedly whisked onto the Winters family private jet, a graceful but carefully calculated move orchestrated by Devin Winters. Who knew that Mariah Copeland would unravel completely unless someone she trusted stood beside her the moment she was found? Devin's instinct proved correct. Sharon's presence was not just comforting, but essential, grounding Mariah in the final chaotic hours of a crisis that had spiraled so far out of control that even seasoned Genoa City residents, accustomed to drama, stood speechless. The strategy worked, but its emotional cost lingered heavily in the air. While the audience had long suspected that Mariah's emotional state was far more fragile than anyone in her orbit realized, the residents of Genoa City were blindsided by the truth. Mariah had been on the run with baby Dominic, fleeing in a haze of fear and psychological fragmentation after kidnapping him from the Chancellor Mansion. What shocked them even more was how long she had survived on fear alone, clinging to Dominic as if he were both shield and lifeline. Yet for viewers, the signs had been there all along: small cracks in Mariah's facade, growing tremors beneath the surface, and the long shadow of trauma that had never fully left her. The seeds of this catastrophic breakdown had been planted months earlier, when Ian Ward, one of the most sinister figures in Mariah's past, made his unsettling reappearance. The moment he resurfaced at the mental health facility where Mariah had voluntarily sought treatment, a dark cloud settled over her storyline. Fans knew Ian was alive. Genoa City did not. That gap between audience knowledge and character belief created an undercurrent of dread. Viewers questioned whether Ian was stalking her, manipulating her quietly, or merely existing as a symbol of the pain she couldn't outrun. His presence, whether targeted or incidental, triggered something deep and destabilizing in Mariah, dredging up memories of captivity, control, and the terrifying loss of agency that once defined her early years. Her internal world, already delicate, began to tilt. And when the pressure intensified Dominic's importance, her fear of being replaced, her unresolved wounds from motherhood slipping through her fingers, it was only a matter of time before flight became her instinctive refuge. In the aftermath of the ordeal, as officers secured Dominic and handed him safely back into the arms of his relieved family, Devin Winters and Abby Newman Winters finally exhaled for the first time in days. The panic that had seized them in agony only parents confronted with the nightmare of a missing child could truly understand finally loosened its grip. Losing Dominic would have shattered them completely. Finding him alive and unharmed felt like waking from a nightmare into a world restored. Their home, once a place of warmth and laughter, had transformed into a chamber of dread during the search. Now, with Dominic back in their arms, it could breathe again. Their gratitude toward Sharon, Christine, the detectives, and everyone involved overflowed, yet beneath the relief lay another truth: emotional wounds remained, not only for themselves, but for Mariah, whose unraveling would cast a long shadow over the coming weeks. Once Dominic was brought home, the Chancellor Mansion regained its quiet dignity. The interior, beautifully preserved, radiated a power and nostalgia that connected present turmoil to Genoa City's storied past. For longtime viewers, the chance to once again see the grand rooms that once belonged to Catherine Chancellor felt like stepping into a sacred place. The polished wood, the rich fabrics, the warm lighting, it all whispered echoes of the indomitable woman who had shaped so many lives across generations. And there, above the fireplace, hung the portrait that embodied both her strength and her benevolence. Its placement felt deliberate, almost spiritual, as though Catherine herself watched over her descendants, guiding them through storms they couldn't yet understand. The set designers earned well-deserved praise for honoring both legacy and emotional weight with such meticulous care. It reminded everyone that the Chancellor name carried history, resilience, and unbreakable bonds, even in moments when those bonds were tested by betrayal, fear, or desperation. Dominic's safe return felt almost divinely orchestrated. Fans joked that Catherine, in whatever ethereal realm she now resided, must have intervened, using that legendary steel-spined willpower to ensure her family remained intact. The idea that she protected her great-grandson from afar comforted viewers and characters alike, wrapping the moment in a mythology that only the young and the restless could make believable. With Dominic back, Devin and Abby embraced a fragile peace. They could now turn their focus to healing, both individually and as a family. They would try to forget the nightmare, though its imprint would linger. Fear never truly disappears, even when danger is gone. But for Mariah, the nightmare was only beginning. Her arrest, orchestrated with care to avoid traumatizing Dominic further, placed her firmly in the hands of the legal system. Yet she was far from alone. Sharon, acting from both maternal love and deep insight into trauma, stood by her daughter's side with unwavering compassion. She saw the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the shock that left Mariah unable to form coherent sentences. She understood immediately that this was not malice, it was a breakdown, a collapse of emotional foundations that had been unstable for far too long. Sharon recognized the signs because she had lived them, battled them, and survived them. And now she would guide her daughter through the same darkness. Christine Blair, too, stepped into her familiar role as both advocate and investigator. Her involvement brought hope not because she could make the charges disappear, but because she sought truth before judgment. She understood that Mariah's case was more complex than a simple legal violation. The emotional history, the resurgence of Ian Ward, the fragile psychology Mariah carried with her, these elements mattered. They shaped intent, influenced actions, and could ultimately determine her fate in court. Christine had fought similar battles before. She knew when compassion was not only appropriate but necessary. The horror that has been quietly consuming Mariah Copeland for months, perhaps even years, has never been fully defined, not by the characters around her, and not even by Mariah herself. What viewers witnessed on the surface was a woman spiraling, unraveling, and ultimately breaking under the weight of a trauma that no one in Genoa City had fully understood. But beneath that, under layers of fear, suppressed memories, and unresolved wounds, lived a narrative so dark and tangled that even those closest to her could not yet fathom the depth of her suffering. The audience had been given fragments, faint flashbacks, trembling breaths, scattered images from a past she tried desperately to outrun. Those pieces painted only the outline of a far more haunting truth. The reveal that something catastrophic happened during Mariah's work trip for Cassidy First the previous year was merely the first crack in a dam that had been holding back an emotional flood. The flashbacks hinted at panic confined to a room, a man's shadow looming over her, a sense of helplessness so overwhelming that Mariah, even in the present, shrank into herself when touched by certain memories. That man Will Hensley entered the storyline not as a traditional villain, but as a puzzle piece whose shape seemed disturbingly familiar. He was older, calm, experienced in exploiting vulnerabilities, and his presence subtly mirrored the demeanor of Ian Ward. The moment Will interacted with Mariah, something inside her froze and then awoke simultaneously. She recognized danger, but also something twisted and magnetic, a psychological imprint left behind by her past with Ian. Viewers sensed immediately that Will represented more than a passing acquaintance on her business trip. His existence in her orbit felt deliberate, predatory, and psychologically charged. Why Mariah felt drawn to him even for a fleeting moment became one of the darkest layers of the unfolding tragedy. It wasn't attraction, it was trauma bonding, the instinctive pull of a person who resembles the monster who once controlled her life. Victims of prolonged psychological manipulation sometimes find themselves tethered to the familiar shape of their abuser, even when they consciously reject them. Will's tone, his quiet authority, the way he looked at Mariah not with affection, but with evaluation triggered something deep inside her. A fractured mirror reflecting years of conditioning under Ian's cult, The Path. And when Will cornered her in that room, whatever happened next would burst forward like a memory she had spent decades trying to silence. The audience watched a brief flash of Mariah's hands clamped around Will's throat, her eyes wide with terror rather than rage. But the truth of that moment remained intentionally ambiguous. Did she kill him? Did he survive? Was her reaction self-defense, dissociation, or the shattering of a psyche that could no longer separate past from present? The writers left viewers suspended in a purgatory of uncertainty because Mariah herself didn't know. Trauma had distorted her perception of reality. She couldn't tell whether she was reliving the past or fighting for her life in the present. Swan's character, whose connection to Will remains unclear, only deepened the mystery. Fans questioned whether Swan might be tied to the same cult that once imprisoned Mariah, or perhaps connected to Will in ways that would later surface. The possibility that Will and Swan were part of a broader psychological trap aimed specifically at Mariah lingered ominously, especially as her mental state deteriorated. Meanwhile, the fate of Ian Ward spiraled toward its own violent conclusion. The confrontation at the Newman Rancho place, already saturated with decades of tragedy, marked the final collapse of the monster who had terrorized Mariah's youth. Victor Newman, himself a man accustomed to life-or-death confrontations, had been shot during the struggle, but managed to return fire. The bullet that struck Ian was fatal, ending the reign of a man whose influence stretched like a shadow across years of Genoa City's history. As Ian's blood stained the floors of the Newman home, characters who had once been under his control spoke their final words to him. For some, it was closure; for others, a final release of fear. But for Mariah, the moment resonated differently. When she stood over his dying body, her face a storm of grief and fury, her farewell sounded less like goodbye and more like a wound tearing open. She mourned not the man, but the fragments of herself he had stolen. She grieved the lost childhood, the manipulation, the years spent believing her identity belonged to someone else. And after speaking her final truth to the dying man who shaped so much of her suffering, something inside Mariah snapped. She carried that rupture with her like an invisible bruise, raw and throbbing, until it burst in the quiet horror of another bedroom, this time, the room where Will lay helpless, with Mariah pressing a pillow over his face in a moment that blurred hallucination, fear, and rage into one indistinguishable impulse.